All right, this looks like critical mass. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name's Tim Carroll. I am the Senior Press Secretary here at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Really appreciate everyone hopping on this morning on a Friday. Happy Halloween to all. We're going to kick off with some comments from C2ES President Nat Cohen. As many of you know, Nat is an economist with more than 20 years of energy and environmental policy experience, including stints at EDF and in the Obama White House. And he's led us here at C2ES since 2021. And following that, we will hear from our Vice President for International Strategies, Kaveh Guillempour, who will offer some insights on what we expect out of COP30 and what we have been tracking throughout the year as we've been involved in the process. Kaveh also joined us in 2021, coming our way from the UN. And again, as many of you know, was also a head climate negotiator in the UK and elsewhere before that. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is going to be recorded. We'll post this to our YouTube channel later today, and I'll send the link around as soon as it's available in case you missed anything. After we get through the remarks, we're going to open up to questions. We ask that you please use the raised hand function through Zoom, and we will get to as many as we can in the time that we have left. We also ask that you keep your mics muted to avoid any background noise until the Q&A gets started. A few final things. Nat and Kaveh will both be in Belém for COP this year. Nat will be on the ground November 10th to November 12th, and he will be in Sao Paulo later that same week. Kaveh will be there for the duration. So if you have folks heading out there, I know some are covering from DC and elsewhere in the US and across the globe. Some are making the trip out to Belém. Please stay in touch if you'd like to grab an interview with either of them, get quick reactions. You can reach me anytime at carolT@c2es.org or via cell at 586-567-0162. We will also be sharing, as we do every year, regular updates on negotiations and COP proceedings. And if you'd like to receive those and are not already on our press list, please reach out to me. So I'm very excited to have everyone here today. I will now kick it over to Nat.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Nat Cohen. I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. I think, as folks know, C2ES is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works with policymakers and businesses in the US and around the globe to advance policy and technology solutions to climate and energy challenges. And core to our work is the conviction that smart and well-designed policies can accelerate the low carbon transition while growing the economy, sustaining good jobs, and improving everyday lives. We work closely with the more than 40 Fortune 500 companies in our business council, as well as another 150 companies in our broader network to develop and advocate for those policies. And in just a few minutes, my colleague Kaveh Guillempour will dive into the context of the COP and our expectations for it. As most of you know, part of our work for a long time has been in the international arena. The C2ES team is deeply embedded in the negotiations. We convene senior negotiators, heads of delegation several times a year in the Chatham House conversations to help make progress, identify zones of consensus. Our increasing focus, as you'll hear from Kaveh, is how to position the Paris Agreement to continue to drive more effective international cooperation on climate going forward. And Kaveh will talk about how and why this COP is a pivotal one in that effort. I want to set the stage for the conversation by laying out a couple of trends I see in the low carbon economy, both in the US and globally, and how that shapes the context for international cooperation on climate. To start off, it's no secret. I think we all know we face some really challenging headwinds for climate action right now. The political context in Washington, renewed uncertainty in the global economic outlook, rising concerns around energy security, and attacks on the multilateral order that has prevailed since the Second World War. And in the US, of course, we've seen this administration seeking to undermine progress on climate and clean energy, both at home and abroad. Those headwinds are real, but we also see two trends that give us some more hope, and that's what I want to highlight. First, we're beginning to see the tangible economic benefits from the advanced energy future. We see battery factors and other advanced manufacturing. We see new clean energy facilities coming online, creating jobs, and creating a new economic future in communities in the US and around the world. We saw that and how that plays out in the US in the budget law fight this past summer. We were up on the Hill, Republican offices in both chambers, often alongside companies in our networks, always armed with fact sheets and data about the jobs and investment that were flowing into districts and states. And those economic arguments were the ones that really resonated. They didn't always win the day because we had to deal with an increasingly polarized national conversation. But what we did see was that for the first time I've been working on this issue, and I think the first time ever, the local economic arguments favor clean energy. And that was one of the factors in our view that meant that even as we lost important credits for electric vehicles and wind and solar, we were able to preserve key tax credits for next generation carbon free electricity, for advanced manufacturing, and other technologies that will be crucial to meeting our long term emissions reductions goals and our growing energy demands. I think it's really important to understand, to underscore how much of a shift this is. When I started working on this issue 20, 25 years ago, those economic benefits were hypothetical, they were all in the future. They're increasingly real now, and I think that's changing the politics both here and abroad. Second, we're in a much more dynamic energy context than we have been in half a century. Electrification, the AI race, reshoring manufacturing are all driving booming energy demand just when the costs of clean energy have plummeted. Now, that plays out in a lot of different ways. We see rising electricity costs for a bunch of reasons that don't have to do with renewable energy come to the fore of the political conversation in the US and Europe. We see in an increasingly fractured and fractious world, everyone focused on energy security. That means different things in different places. And we see tariffs and other barriers to trade that are limiting trade in fossil and clean technologies alike. But in a world in which the arrow of technological change is pointing toward lower carbon, I think that clean energy is going to win out. And all of that is playing in the direction of playing out in the direction of travel on global emissions. We know we're not moving nearly as fast as we need to, but it's also true that a decade after the signing of the Paris Agreement, we're so much further ahead than we were 10 years ago. And that's undeniably in part due to the Paris Agreement itself. So as we head into COP30, we have some very real headwinds, but also some very real reasons for optimism. And with that, let me turn it over to Kaveh.
Thanks, Nat. Thanks, Tim. I'm going to try to share some brief slides here. Let's see if that works. Just a second. Hopefully you can all see my screen here. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the context that Nat talked about and just drill down a little bit on a few things that he was saying. Every COP is sort of touted as being the most significant COP since the Paris Agreement was adopted. But I think for this COP, there's some merit in that, and there's a number of reasons why that's the case. Firstly, the guidance to implement the Paris Agreement is now in place and it's fully operational. So COP29 in Baku adopted the last of the guidance, particularly around Article 6 and carbon markets. So the Paris Agreement is now fully operational, and a big part of the story of the UNFCCC process in terms of negotiations is now settled. Secondly, the first ambition cycle under the Paris Agreement will have been completed by the time we get to Berlin. And that comprises the first global stocktake that took place in COP29, the submissions of new NDCs. We still see them coming through, but many more are going to come through by the time we get to COP30, and also the submission of the biennial transparency reports. And today, the UNFCCC published its synthesis of those reports, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. And of course, there's increasing calls for a focus on implementation and away from the focus on negotiations that we've had in the past. The second thing I would say is the Paris Agreement and the international climate regime is at risk. Nat outlined some of the headwinds. We have the rise of populism and very clear attacks on multilateralism. We have the fact that the US is going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and that will take effect on the 20th of January next year. Until recently, we've had emissions rising and ever growing impacts, both in frequency and in severity around the world. And we have a situation where the Paris Agreement is founded around the notion of nationally determined contributions or national climate targets. And as of a few days ago, at least, only around 60 out of the 196 parties had submitted those, and a majority of the G20 countries still haven't come forward. So all of that puts the regime at risk. And it sort of led to a situation where there's a strong political recognition that was first articulated earlier this year in March by ministers at the Petersburg Climate Dialogue that COP30 has to demonstrate that multilateralism is still relevant and working, and that it's relevant to the sort of concerns and priorities of people around the world. So when I speak to journalists and they ask what's going to be new that's coming out of COP30, I think the headline is, if we come out of COP30 demonstrating that the Paris Agreement is alive and functioning, I think in the current context that is pretty newsworthy of itself. So what would we need to have for that to be the case from COP30? And there's sort of six main elements here. First of all, it's a little bit boring, but the COP has to deliver against its mandated technical agenda items. So while these are probably not going to make front page headlines if they're agreed, I'm sure if there's big arguments over them and we don't reach agreement, that you would write those stories. So it's very important that we show that at the technical level, the work is progressing. And the challenge here is that there's no really big ticket mandated political deliverables for this COP, because it is in this sort of transition phase from negotiation to implementation. The second thing that's necessary for success from the COP is that there needs to be some sort of negotiated response to the collective level of ambition represented by new NDCs. So the NDC synthesis report says that we are likely to have seen the peak in global emissions, and that we're likely to see at least a 10% reduction of emissions by 2035. Of course, for a 1.5 pathway, we need to halve emissions by 2030. So we do need to have a response to that progress, but also what needs to be done. And I think COP30 will lack credibility if it doesn't do this, but there's no place on the formal agenda to do that. So that's going to be a big issue. Another important thing is that we need to acknowledge and celebrate the achievements of the Paris Agreement. If we were going into a political campaign for election, we wouldn't lead by all the things that we'd failed to do and all the things we still need to do. We would be leading by showing what we have achieved so far. And we're about to release a paper as CTS that sets that out. So while there's a long way to go, if you look back at how far we've come in just 10 years, there's a lot that's been achieved, including over 190 countries having national climate plans, which was definitely not the case before. This COP also has to have a strong focus on adaptation. The global goal on adaptation indicators need to be agreed. There's a strong push on tripling finance, and also a push for countries to come forward with national adaptation plans. The COP30 presidencies come out with a vision to align the action agenda with the outcomes of the global stocktake. Often when the action agenda is mentioned, people sort of look at their feet and shuffle around and wonder what the relevance is. This is where the implementation happens. So if we're serious about a shift to implementation, the action agenda is where that is going to take place. And the vision of the presidency to align the action agenda, which has hundreds of different initiatives, to align that with the outcomes of the global stocktake, such as the tripling of renewable energy, the fossil fuel transition to clean energy, early warning systems for all by 2027. That allows everybody to sort of track progress in the action agenda and for everyone to be pulling in the same direction. And I really believe that this is a truly transformational vision. And the last thing I would say is that an often forgotten element of the Paris Agreement that the US in particular, among others, fought very hard for in the run-up to Paris, it was actually the US's top priority, was the enhanced transparency framework, where every country, whether they're developed or developing, the US or China, the EU or the small islands, have to report every 2 years on how they have progressed against their goals. And this has been synthesized just today from the UNFCCC that shows well over 100 countries have come forward, and that the majority of countries have shown that they have progressed against their climate plans. That only shows a backward-looking snapshot up until 2022. So the next synthesis report will show further progress, but it's very encouraging, while of course there's more to do. And at COP30, we will see the European Union, South Africa, and other countries already presenting progress against the achievements of their first target. So this is not something to be missed. because judging progress against implementation is as important as judging the ambition of targets on paper. So that was a quick run through from me, and back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Kaveh. So now we will open it up to questions. Again, if you could use the raised hand function, we will get to as many as we can in the time we still have left. And we will kick it off with Rachel from the Hill.
Hi, thank you guys for doing this and taking my question. I'm wondering if you can speak more about the impacts, if any, on this administration's not only withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, but sort of general decision not to pursue climate action or climate policies. Like, what impact is that having on, other nations and their own climate ambitions, and what impacts, if any, will that have on the COP?
I'm happy to start off on that and then to hand over to Nat. I mean, I think the thing that I've been struck with is at all the meetings that I've been to from that first political gathering in Berlin is that other countries are there and they're united on taking things forward. So there was a very united message back in March at the Petersburg Climate Dialogue that the rest of the world is going ahead. And the absence of the US didn't really feature. It certainly didn't feature specifically. And of course, the world has been here before. So I think everybody's still marching ahead. And it's really important that this COP shows that even without the US, the Paris Agreement is working. My main reflection is that it's just very sad to go to meetings and see the US nameplate there and no one sitting behind it, because there's discussions about the future energy shape and opportunities in the world, which the US could be partaking of, and it's just sad to see that gap there. But I don't know if Nat wanted to come in with anything.
Yeah, I'll just echo that point. I mean, and Kaveh obviously has his finger on the pulse of what's happening and the impact on the negotiations. I'll just say from a U.S. standpoint, this is the most consequential period for energy in my lifetime, at least, well, my conscious lifetime. I guess I was around for the oil shocks, but I wasn't paying attention. And so to have, and so much of that is going to be shaped by the transition to lower carbon by climate action and investments in clean energy technologies. And for the U.S. to be on the sidelines during that, I think is, regardless of what you think the outcome should be, it is undermining U.S. interests and preventing the U.S. from shaping that. And I think stepping away from what are increasingly central negotiations, or at least a central topic for the globe and for energy, international geopolitical security at this time is something that hurts the U.S., I think, more than it does the negotiations.
Thanks both. Let's go over to Zach from Politico.
Thanks. This is going to be kind of an inarticulate question, I think, but I mean, the trade show element here is a tough thing for us journalists on the ground to assess and access. But it's become increasingly important, especially in a time when, as Kaveh said, there's not really a negotiated outcome here. So what are you looking for in a moment of rising trade tensions? Like, what are some potential silver linings you might see out of this trade show element, this real economy element? Because, in the past, like, there's been stories about US is striking LNG deals at Sharm el-Sheikh and, things like that. So like, what do you expect to see coming out of the trade show, real economy side of things at this COP?
I mean, I can set the scene, but I think Nat should also come in on this. I think I share your frustration with the action agenda. So as a negotiator, I used to always wonder what this thing was about. I never went to any side events, but I've had my mind completely changed. And I think what the Peruvian COP presidency and then the French did at COP21 about setting the space with this was really visionary that they did that, and thank goodness they did, because that's now where the action is. But since COP21, where Paris was adopted, I think there's been somewhere between 500 and 700 initiatives launched. And what this presidency has done is set a structure for this that hopefully will be stabilized so that it's much easier to navigate what's going on in that landscape. So by organizing the action agenda to map against the outcomes of the first global stocktake, it'll be much easier to see which initiatives are relevant to which negotiating outcomes. And if that's stabilized across multiple presidencies, you won't be wondering each year how things are organized and why they're relevant. So I think it's definitely a thing to lean into, Zach, and others, and to really explore that. And they're also introducing an element of accountability. So for those initiatives that are going to be part of this structure, there's going to be a need to report on progress, so that it's not just a case of just making an announcement and disappearing. But I'm sure Nat's got some thoughts here.
Yeah, I'll just double click on that point and then say something quick about this particular COP. Actually, let me reverse it. I think I'll sort of this particular COP and then the longer run. I think in this particular COP, um, I mean, there will be the action agenda. I think there will be a little bit less of that. Obviously, as folks know, some, there's going to be events in Sao Paulo. There's going to be events in Rio. There's going to be events in Belém. I'm expecting that it will look more like it did pre-Glasgow, at least on the ground in Belém, than it did, in the last couple of years, where in Subiniaz's memorable phrase, right, you had the central negotiation, you had the Greater Metropolitan COP. I think that Greater Metropolitan COP is going to look a little bit different this year. Having said that, I want to double click on what Kaveh said, because I love what Kaveh said. When you mention the action agenda, people like shuffle their feet and stare at their shoes. I think it's an inside game thing, but this has the potential to be pivotal. What you've had growing up basically over the past decade, you've had this sort of separation between, again, those internal negotiations, the COP negotiations, what's who called the COP, and that Greater Metropolitan COP, the action agenda. And like suburban sprawl, that action agenda has gotten bigger and bigger and less connected to the hub. And that's created two challenges. One is you have all of these things being announced and no accountability, no tracking. There are hundreds of things that have been launched and set off into the world, and nobody's really coming back to them. And there's no structure. The other is you have so much happening outside the negotiations, but there's no sort of connection back in. And I think what's so interesting and important about what Kaveh said, what the Brazilian presidency is looking to do by structuring the action agenda, and it sounds super inside game, but by structuring that action agenda around the priorities that the COP identifies through the global stocktake, that's a really important way of solving both of those problems. So now you have some structure on the action agenda, guidance for what all those companies and NGOs outside the process, where they should be focusing their efforts. And you also have a structure to track that. To give you a quick example, one of the leading things out of the last global stocktake, tripling renewable energy. Imagine if we were in a cycle where there was real structure, and you'll start to see this in Brazil, but real structure around aligning all of the efforts outside the COP around tripling renewable energy as a way of really focusing effort and aligning those sort of actions. I think you'd see a lot more progress. And so that's not going to happen overnight, but that is what I think this COP could set the ground for.
Thank you. Let's go over to Sarah from E&E, and then I know Jennifer DeLuey has a question too, so we'll get to that next.
Hi, thanks for doing this. You've talked about how consequential a summit this is, and yet I don't think we're seeing a big push by leaders to show up at the summit. And I'm wondering, given some of the logistical challenges that might prevent large attendance by some delegations, if you have concerns that, there won't be sort of the critical mass of delegates and delegations that are needed to provide that support and that messaging that you're looking for.
Thanks, Sarah. I think on the leaders, we'll have to wait and see what the numbers are. So I'm sure that President Lula is going to have a lot of people showing up, but whether or not it's the same numbers as previous COPs, we'll just have to wait and see. On the logistics, my sense is that the problems around that have resolved to some extent. I mean, compared to the uncertainty that we had before, it's clear that people are able to find rooms and to be there. The issue, of course, is the prohibitive cost, which is not helpful. The main thing is, I don't think it's a bad thing, actually, that the COP gets smaller. And I don't think it's a bad thing that to a large extent, many of the action agenda events are happening in a different city, because I think moving to a model where the core negotiations become smaller, but the action agenda maybe happen in cities that are more accessible, I think that's fine. but the fact that that's happening as a result of expensive hotels isn't great. The main thing is that we need to see that there's representation in terms of that all countries can be there. In terms of the numbers of participants from countries, I think that's less of an issue for me. It's the wide representation. I mean, we have some COPs where particular countries are sending 2,000 people to the COP. I mean, that just shouldn't be happening anymore. Many delegations are sending over 200, 250 people. So I think we need to get to a situation where every delegation can send 10 people to cover the main things in the rooms. So yes, I'm a little bit worried that the poorer countries may not have the bandwidth to cover all the negotiations, but that's also why there's negotiating groups so that some of the efforts can be spread.
Thanks. Let's go over to Jen. You should be able to unmute. Um,
Thanks, Tim, and thank you all for doing this. I really just wanted to ask about the Leaders Summit and kind of the relative importance of that in this moment where things feel a little uncertain, particularly with the U.S. retreat. What are you looking for? What do you need to hear from leaders? And is there anything in particular that you will be watching?
Yeah, it's still a bit unclear how this is going to pan out and what the aims are for it. But the leaders can have a very important role in setting the tone and the context for the meeting. So what we saw, for example, at the Petersburg Climate Dialogue earlier this year and at other gatherings, is that the political level is emphasizing the importance of seeing the bigger picture, showing the world that multilateralism is working, trying to take our heads out of the details and seeing the bigger prize. And then what you're seeing the negotiator level doing when they get to the technical negotiations in Bonn is that they got stuck on fighting over agendas and got into the weeds. So I think that the political level could send a very strong signal and tone about what the COP is about. But of course, this overarching thing that sort of Nat touched on earlier, and I mentioned that the Paris Agreement is working. It's only just become fully operational, and we need to give it a chance to deliver. And the signs are that it is delivering, and also a sort of a political overlay of continued commitment, but also why this is relevant to ordinary people and why this is delivering for them. I think those are the kind of things that I'll be looking for. Of course, I think the Brazilians will also be looking for particular announcements like the Tropical Forest Forever facility. There may be other announcements. Many countries will probably show up at Berlin with their NDCs. So we'll see announcements around that. Hopefully, the European Union will be one of those that does that. But yeah, I think it can be very important.
Thanks, Kaveh. I've got a question in the chat from NHK Japan. Stephanie, I hope it's okay if I paraphrase a little bit here, but Stephanie's looking to understand if we have a sense of who from the US government will be participating this year and what we expect as far as their presence. And also if we can share anything about non-governmental participation from the US, what kind of people from the US might participate and how large could that group be? And Kaveh, I'm sure you've got a good sense of this. Nat, I don't know if you want to talk to some of the folks that we're engaging with too.
So just very briefly, none of the meetings that I've been to this year has the US been present in an official level, and I haven't heard anything specific to indicate that they will be at COP30 in any official level either. Nat, I don't know if you want to come in on the NGO participation and
Yeah, I mean, I think on the NGO participation, as I mentioned briefly, I think there'll be a lot of folks. There'll be some folks in Rio. There'll be some folks in Sao Paulo. There'll be some folks in Belém. I think it'll be more scattered than it has been in the past. I also, Tim, I'm going to shift over. Let's continue to go with questions. I'm going to shift over to my phone, and I'll try to stay on for at least 5 more minutes.
Appreciate that. Let's go over to Lisa Friedman from New York Times.
Hi, thank you guys so much for doing this, and forgive me if this has been addressed. I hopped on late, but just tacking on to that last question about, what US engagement might look like. I'm wondering, do you want to see the US government there? And I wonder if, an engaged US even seat at the table might behave very differently than it did during Trump 1. Can you give us some visibility into how you're thinking about, you know, what you might do if the US works with other countries to say, I don't know, anything, not recognize the the Paris Agreement, for example, or any number of ways it could throw bombs.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, thanks for the question. I mean, just to reiterate, I haven't heard anything to suggest that the US will be present, so I haven't really thought in that mode. The question I would have is how would they engage? Because there's literally nobody left at the State Department that has any experience of how COPs operate or how to even engage with the negotiations. So I'm not even sure what engagement would look like if anybody from the US were to come. So, as I say, I think if the US were present, there's lots of opportunities there for the administration to witness how there could be beneficial engagement from the perspective of the US. But I haven't seen any evidence or interest from the administration at all on this so far this year. But it would be interesting to see if anybody does come.
Let's go back over to Zach.
Thanks. I mean, just piggybacking off that, I mean, what's the value in anything coming out of this COP if the US, the world's largest economy and largest historical emitter, isn't actually participating?
I think the value is that the sort of trends that we're seeing that Nat sort of talked about earlier, and I mentioned there's also evidence in the NDC synthesis report and the BTR synthesis report over that period where the US has previously left the Paris Agreement and rejoined. There's still been progress at the global level towards reducing emissions and projected temperature rise. So I think if one party steps away, I think the answer can't be that everybody else just gives up. Everybody else just has to double down because in the end, the science doesn't change. The facts are still the facts. And at some point, whether they want to or not, every country on this planet is going to have to engage with this topic because the reality is going to come around in one way or the other. So I think we just have to keep moving forwards. The countries that are still in can still take advantage of the opportunities, the economic opportunities that are arising, and also prepare for the inevitable impacts. And I think even outside of the Paris Agreement, there's ways that the US can engage that would be constructive. So there's areas that this administration is engaging in, such as accelerating on nuclear, looking at things like carbon capture technologies, all of which have to be part of the solution. And I think all of that is good and part of the context that we need to lean into. But if one party steps away, the others have to double down and move ahead. And the whole design of the Paris Agreement was to anticipate that sort of shock and flexibility and to be a resilient and durable instrument. And it's survived one withdrawal from the US, and I think it will survive this one as well.
Lisa, do you have a follow-up or is that a legacy hand?
Legacy hand, sorry.
Okay. All right. If there are no other questions from the group, I don't see any other hands up. I think we can wrap it up there. Appreciate Nat and Kaveh for joining today and sharing some insights. Appreciate you all for joining. I know there are a ton of these out there. We will share the recording around to the folks who registered. As a reminder, Nat and Kaveh will be on the ground in Belém, Nat from the 10th to the 12th, and Kaveh through the duration. So if you're looking for folks to chat with and get further insights as the process goes on over the next couple of weeks, please reach out to me and we'll get those set up. We'll also be putting out our daily or at least regular updates from COP on the ground as we have in years past. So if you'd like to get on our press list for that, please let me know. And if there were any questions we couldn't get to today, we are happy to follow up with those. We will be very, very engaged in COP over the next couple of weeks and looking forward to being as helpful as we can to you all. So with that, thank you for joining, and we'll wrap it up there.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tim.
Everyone.